Good evening. Almost 30 years ago, the Menil Foundation pursued an unprecedented and rather extraordinary act of cultural stewardship, offered the opportunity to purchase 38 fragments of what turned out to be 2 stolen Byzantine frescoes. Dominique de Menil felt compelled to work towards their rescue and preservation. The frescoes were acquired by the Menil Foundation on behalf of the Greek Orthodox Church of Cyprus, which ultimately led to a partnership to restore the frescoes and present them in our beautiful chapel building here in Houston. That building opened to the public in 1997. I am sure that by now you all have heard the news that our beloved Byzantine frescoes that have been on loan to us for more than 20 years and on display in our Byzantine Fresco Chapel will be returning to Cyprus this coming spring. That, in a very narrow sense, is why we are here today for a discussion about cultural heritage. But that really is only part of the story. The Menil Foundation has long championed a position as a kind of an intellectual leader on issues that relate to cultural heritage, whether from the perspective of the spiritual appreciation of art from different cultures and periods, or engaging with civil rights issues that, in a very different way, address how we think about the cultural heritage of our own society. I am very grateful to Kristina Van Dyke, our Curator of Collections and Research, for organizing this evening's discussion and program. As we approached the announcement about the return of the frescoes, Kristina saw an opportunity to connect the dots on cultural heritage in different ways. An opportunity to shift the discussion from the common one in art museums about the ownership of ancient works of art to a new set of important areas that affect countries and cultures around the globe. Kristina will moderate this discussion, and with that, I will turn things over to her to introduce our participants and start the conversation.
So there's a story that gets told at the Menil very often, and it's told, in fact, in the 1987 Abrams catalog introduction by Mrs. de Menil speaking. She's speaking about a Renaissance painting that is at the National Gallery in Washington that was once owned by Bernard Berenson. And it's a painting of St. John in the Wilderness, and it's by the painter Veneziano. And she said, "I'm so fond of this strange and miraculous little painting that I experience it as totally mine when I stand in front of it. And I think that in the years to come, there will be those unknown to me who will take," and she wrote in quotes, "possess works I have acquired." I love this quote because I think it perfectly captures Dominique de Menil's relationship with art. A recognition that the painting preceded her by centuries, was well loved by others, and despite the fact that she would never own it, she owned a share of it because it got inside her. In fact, the de Menil's attitude about their experience with art might be best thought of in terms of being possessed by art as opposed to possessing art. They had an extraordinary commitment to the idea that artworks have lives, and that their job as patrons was to set up the conditions to make those lives the fullest ones possible. The Byzantine Fresco Chapel is a testament to that. Knowing full well that she would never own the frescoes or even keep them in Houston for a long period of time, Dominique de Menil ensured that they would live on for future generations by acting as their temporary steward. She did so in advance of cultural heritage policies that advocate returning works of art to countries of origin. And what I find exceptional about the Byzantine Fresco Chapel story is the way that it created a mechanism for circulation of the works of art and broadened access to them. It was a complex and thoughtful response to a complicated situation. It is in this spirit that we have convened this roundtable to address the challenges that lie ahead for shared human heritage. And before I go any further, I want to announce that we have just today launched our Byzantine Fresco Chapel website. So if you have an interest in this in story in more depth, you should go there and look at it. It's www.byzantinefrescochapel.org. So this roundtable seeks to bring diverse insights from fields such as intellectual property and biomedical ethics, among others, to bear on the challenges faced by the stakeholders of cultural heritage debates. Technological advancements in these fields outpace international law, forcing them to identify creative solutions to property rights that are pertinent to the domain of cultural heritage. This roundtable aims to shift the emphasis of cultural heritage debates away from objects' materiality to their myriad functions and their diverse constituencies. Its goal is to identify cultural heritage policies that remain open to and expand contingent relationships between objects and stewards over time. Cultural heritage debates in the past 2 decades have been characterized by a tendency to think of objects in terms of tangible property, to which nations or institutions make ultimate title claims. This approach has resulted in the fraught effort to establish and freeze stakeholders' identities in legal terms, and those stakeholders can be national, ethnic, religious, institutional. Though such efforts are rooted in an impulse to distribute rights to the objects to the greatest possible public, particularly in their country of origin, it has yielded unsatisfying results. Not only are national and international law confronted with the challenge of identifying successor populations for objects produced when contemporary nations and institutions were not in existence, but they face the added burden of deputizing authoritative representatives for these groups. The transfer of object title to these groups is often conceived of as final and enduring. However, the relationship between a group and an object at any given moment is necessarily historical and contingent. Because stakeholders of cultural heritage do not share a universal and timeless definition of property, policies should move towards concepts of variable stewardship that take diverse notions of property into account over time, as opposed to perpetuating models of ultimate and exclusive ownership. Fields such as intellectual property, which consider intangible knowledge, or biomedical ethics, which encompass intangible and intangible dimensions of knowledge and production, would seem to have much to contribute to debates on cultural heritage. These disciplines have proven to be comparatively adaptive to challenging political, social, and technological landscapes. One of the most compelling examples of this, of course, is the Creative Commons movement, which seeks to move away from a totalizing and anachronistic concept of copyright to one that takes the complexities of the international digital age into account by allowing creators to voluntarily reserve and waive rights to aspects of their production. This approach demonstrates a willingness to engage with changing demands on legal and cultural structures, largely brought about by technology. It acknowledges the increasingly powerful role of the individual whose actions are not performed in concert with others as part of a group, but rather aggregate into meaningful and ever-changing constituencies that affect change without an appointed voice of authority. The application of this type of thinking to tangible cultural heritage represents exciting opportunities for the future. In order to make this conceptual and practical leap in the domain of cultural heritage, we might consider the ways in which biomedical ethics is addressing shifts in thinking about property, individual, and communal rights, and the tangible dimension of the body. For example, the field has had to grapple with a range of issues concerning individual or group rights to sell, donate, or dispose of body parts, embryos, or genetic material, and the shortcomings of national and international law, which often lag behind scientific developments. We see similar potential in the ways in which intangible and tangible dimensions of property are considered in environmental law, where drilling rights, for example, must be negotiated with Native American communities whose historical relationship to preceding populations is as fraught with legal pitfalls akin to those of cultural heritage. So this is just to give you a kind of sense of where and how this panel emerged. And now I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, and I know you all have the flyer on your seat, so I'll be brief about it so we can get on with the conversation. First we have First we have James Leach, who is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where he's a specialist in New Guinea. Next to him, we have Kirsten Matthews, who is a Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy here at Rice University. Following Kirsten is Robin Nava, who is Worldwide General Counsel for Well Services at Schlumberger. And next to her, Joseph Flowers, who manages software and regulatory compliance for well services at Schlumberger. And finally, we have Rex Kuntz, who is the director of the School of Art at the University of Houston and an art historian specializing in ancient Mesoamerican cultures. So I will join my colleagues at the podium and we'll start talking. So James, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about your work, which has dealt with notions of ownership and property in New Guinea, and to talk a little bit about how you've come to understand property as a historical and cultural concept.
Thank you very much, Kristina. It's a great honor to be here and to see so many people. It's amazing. I've spent a little time in the collection this afternoon, and I think it's an amazing place. I think I'm being asked to start because I'm going to throw the cat among the pigeons, or try and open things up a little by just considering what we mean by property and by objects, if I may. I would like to just pick up on a couple of things that, Kristina, some of the vocabulary that you've used, if I may, to see if we can't open those concepts up slightly. So the first thing to say is that we tend to think of property as a relationship between people and things, people and objects even. But anthropologists for a long time have pointed out that in fact property is a relationship between people with regard to things. So rather than property being rather than there being one way that people might relate to things, property is one form of cultural expression about the way that people relate to one another in regard to things, which emerged in a very particular historical epoch, that is the Enlightenment period in Europe. Now, if you accept that property therefore is a particular historical phenomena that emerged in a particular place, then what are the assumptions that one has to have about people and things in order for it to work? And what I wanted to suggest is that Kristina used the term ownership and the term property, and I would just like to start by making a distinction between those, because I tend to think, having worked in Papua New Guinea, where private property is not really apparent in the way that people relate to things, that we should think of private property as a very particular and a rather constrained form of ownership. And ownership, I would like to actually be a much wider term, a term within which we can accommodate all sorts of other ways that people relate to one another with regard to things. And those might include notions of belonging, notions of connection, which don't involve the key parts of property, which is exclusive individual control and the right to alienate. So when we come to hear in a moment from Kristin about biological material in people's bodies, we have a real problem in thinking of that as private property, or when we start to think of that as private property that is alienable and with exclusive rights that someone else may acquire in bodily substance, we're left with a problem. There's a conceptual issue there. But if we tended to think of the relation that people have to this as belonging and that being something different to property, then that maybe opens up the issue again. Now, there was one other thing that I wanted to introduce, and that's another distinction, because private property as a particular mode of relating to things involves in thinking of things as objects. So I wanted to just put out another distinction here, which is between things and objects. Objects are the appropriate form for things to take in a regime of property ownership. And that's because because there's a kind of subject-object distinction implied in property. So people rightly control objects, that is things. People as subjects have rights over objects as things, and they can therefore move these objects around as if they were not other persons. Okay? We can't own other people because they are subjects, but we can own objects as subjects. Much of the work that I've done in New Guinea has been with people who do not think of things as objects. They think of things such as landforms or things that they might carve or make as actually acting as persons in some regard. So they relate to the landscape and they relate to things as if they were other kinds of persons. That means that it's not appropriate for them to think of them as property. They have to think of them as actually constitutive parts of their social relationships with other people. Now, I'm not sure how useful that is as a way to begin, but I did just want to suggest that we might want to not necessarily think of, say, the things in the collection here as objects, of which property rights are the most appropriate way of relating to or owning, because that would tend to put them in a particular kind of position which they possibly didn't have when they were made. Certainly I'm thinking of some of the ethnographic collections here. And it also means that you're getting yourself stuck into a notion of the relation of the collection here as a property owner over things, which means that they have exclusive control and the right to alienate, which is perhaps not appropriate for things that other people have interests in as parts of their heritage.
And when it comes to cultural heritage, thinking about New Guinea, for example, I think the insistence on, or even the kind of naive assumption, right, that that there's a shared notion of property is itself at risk of being kind of neo-colonial, because you're insisting that you're going to have a conversation with a community in New Guinea, let's say, about returning an object, and you're going to assume that they share the same concept of property. So you can see, I think, how quickly how quickly there can be kind of breakdown in communication if there isn't an investigation of multiple types of meaning multiple types of or definitions of property. And Joseph, could you speak to this a little bit? I'm sure everyone is curious how we're going to make the leap from anthropology in New Guinea to gas and oil.
Sure.
And I think you're going to
Thank you
surprise
very much.
them. Yeah.
I'm an engineering manager at Schlumberger, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and be involved in this discussion. It's actually been quite mind-expanding for me to realize that something that I have to worry about every day on every project has so much in common with an issue that is that shows up in the art world, and for a lovely collection like the Menil collection. What has happened is that we have had to understand in the engineering world that the world is no longer a world where a big company like Schlumberger controls everything that it does. We have relationships with many other companies, many other individuals, and it doesn't take long to learn that those relationships require mutual benefit. Benefit for everyone involved, despite the fact that at the end of the day, I might stomp my feet and declare that Schlumberger is in charge. One really, again, mind-opening issue that I ran into over the last few years was I worked on a project that we were manufacturing in Asia. And I was very used to manufacturing in the United States, where we would essentially make a design and think of it as a widget, if you will. We would design a widget, and we would take it to a manufacturer in the United States, and they would build it perfectly, and if they didn't, we would yell at them. And if they would fix it, and then it would be built exactly to our design, and we owned the design, and that was sort of the way it was. I've done some manufacturing in Asia, and our relationship with the manufacturer was very, very different, and I think you'll understand why it applies in just a minute. We sent our design over for them to build. They built it very, very quickly, did a nice job. The product worked very well, and we only came to realize sometime later that it wasn't built to our specific specifications and dimensions, which for an engineer is the day that you cry and stomp and get very upset, because you've been taught to believe all your life that this is how you control things. You tell them what dimension to build it to, and they build it that way. So I was very upset for a time until I realized a couple of important things. One is that this manufacturing company, for very selfish reasons, but maybe for good reasons, had taken ownership of this design and had made it their own. And if there were any issues that they had putting it together, if there were any ways that they thought they could make it better, they did. They didn't ask me. They should have, in my opinion, but they didn't. That this is, again, their culture. They wanted to put this product out as quickly as possible, and they wanted to take control. This gives them a tremendous advantage now. Because now, if I'm not happy with the price they're charging me, for example, I can't walk down the street with my design and say, here, manufacturing company B, you build this. You know, I'm not happy with manufacturing company A, because it won't be the same as what's been built for me already. This manufacturing company has taken this idea of ownership and taken it out of the legal realm. They don't claim any ownership of my design, and they wouldn't build it for my competitors, for example, but they have taken ownership of the way that they build it. And they've taken that and made it work for them, give them value, and have them be stakeholders in the manufacture of this. Why is this good for me? The reason this is good for me is that they now, because they're stakeholders, really want to get it done very quickly. They really want to get it done. Maybe I should just say it that way. They want for everything to work. Before, the manufacturer just wanted to do what I told them to and get paid for it. Now, there's a group that has taken ownership and made it their own. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there in many ways. If we can share in these different issues, whether it's cultural heritage or technology, and let people along the chain become owners in a broad sense, that gives them the same kind of stakeholder interest in success that everybody wants, and everybody, I think, moves forward.
Kirsten, what has your experience been in the world of biology? Surely similar issues crop up having to do with competing notions of ownership. Joseph has just told us about a positive outcome of competing notions of ownership. Do you see positive or negative outcomes in your field?
My area is biomedical research, and I do policy research in that, and thank you so much for inviting me here. In our area, there's a give and take between the scientist and between industry. You want to have your creation, you want to, if it's in biology, you're looking towards the long-term goal, which is human health. And you want to do some research that will later lend to industry, that will lend into a therapy. So there's a relationship you have where it also deals with intellectual property, patents, and things like that, where you definitely want to see the company being involved in bringing this to the individual as a scientist in the positive. But on the other hand, there's also restrictions that this will also place on the research and the access other people can actually have for what is created or the knowledge that you're gained. One of the best, I think, examples that I think really links well to some of the discussions here about the collection would be the idea of what do you own, and do you own yourself in a small sense. There's a story, it's been published really well, about a particular cell line from a woman named Henrietta Lacks. She had a cancer tumor, and that is, we would think, part of herself, and it was removed. It was just discarded, thrown away in the trash. But scientists grabbed it, used it to create cells, and then they used it to create millions of these cells. These cells have been around the world. They've actually been in space. Along the line, someone looked at them and was able to make sure you can make more of them for everybody else to use them because they thought they were great, and put a patent on it. But it was a patenting of somebody's cell. You can identify it back to her because it has her genes in it, her entire genome into it. So there's kind of a schism now of how we're trying to figure out dealing with these issues. It kind of branches beyond just a particular cell. We have other examples talking about people's genes, whether or not sections of them could actually be patented or not. Our patenting system says we can if it was made by man, so if you make a slight alteration, it's okay. And then some of the patents themselves are written, yes, they're not saying it's a particular cell, that's human cell that they're patenting, but it's written so broadly, to a scientist looking at it, it sounds like that's what they're actually patenting. And to a researcher trying to use it, or someone trying to follow through an industry, that's what it feels like. And that kind of reminds me of a lot of the issues we're having here of trying to decide exactly where it comes from and where the link is and the disconnect between the two players.
Rex, what might this have to do with pre-Columbian art?
Well, that's a good question, and I want to begin by saying it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And I think besides all of us being around a great pre-Columbian piece, this might be the single most important conversation we could have about pre-Columbian art. For this reason, I mean, this is such a joy for me to think about in this particular environment, because for years I've worked with the State Department and the FBI to repatriate illicitly imported antiquities. I have worked with any number of museums, examining collections and reviewing the problems that the current situation has really foisted on all of us. There's something broken, really, about collecting pre-Columbian art, about the way that things are circulating, that break my heart, because my criteria when I think about this is simply, how can we maximize the transformative aesthetic experience that these objects offer, and how can we maximize at the same time the invaluable historical information? In fact, in many instances, this is the history of humankind in the Americas. It's the art and the technology that we look at via these objects, because we don't have the written record. Though if we have those two criteria, and we put them up against how objects circulate right now, it's not a great situation. We are not having the outcomes that we wish. And so for the moment, I would just like to point out that thinking outside the current property box is probably the single most important thing I can do, with the exception of looking at the objects themselves.
Robin, when we were chatting together earlier, you made a distinction between protection that covers creativity for something you feel driven to create versus the product, the outcome of that creativity. Could you speak a little bit about that, and then could you take us in the direction of open source thinking and the way that that's affected those notions in your field?
Well, thank you again. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I come from the perspective of intellectual property. And what we're talking about here are different ways in which property rights are established that don't relate necessarily to real property. Some of them do, but they're also just the experience overall. So with respect to the various kinds of property that we've already talked about, each of these improvements that someone makes, the manufacturing facility that makes an improvement, or they believe an improvement to Joseph's design, the interpretation of some sort of cell information to be able to apply that to either multiply, treat, help diagnose, and other treatment, all of these things end up with a useful purpose to society. So most property rights established by nations with respect to non-tangible property distinguish between items in which one feels just simply creative and compelled to create versus items in which one is expending their efforts to create something for some sort of gain, purpose, commercial use, advancement of science. And that second category, they'll establish property rights that person who has expended the effort, or the company who has expended the effort to make these investments, to do the research, will have a point at which they can recover or take the benefit of those advancements. Okay. And so that's the way in which societies have established. The US, of course, our patent rights, our copyrights, our intellectual property rights go all the way back and are based in the Constitution. Many other nations are as well. What we see is that as time goes on, there may need to be certain modifications of those social contracts. It's not that the establishment of those rights to encourage people to expend their efforts to make improvements goes away. It's just the terms by which we will allow that protection to exist. So it may be that certain areas of biomedical are allowed to have protection, other areas are not. In software, what we see is there's a move to places in which people would like to, rather than take advantage of the traditional intellectual property rights that can be afforded the software, they're moving to a situation in which they're trying to define the social contract that goes with that software. And so you see this in the open source software field, where there's different levels of open source software. Some software will be completely available, Other software people will make available to anyone who wants to use it, as long as you acknowledge that you got it from me. Somebody else may want to put the constraints on the software that they're offering to the public too, as long as you acknowledge it to me, and if you make any improvements, you let me use those improvements. So what we see in a lot of the open movements is not an elimination of property rights, but rather a way in which the people who are inherently given those property rights by law and society are offering them up in a modified way.
Rex, could you envision a kind of open source orientation towards pre-Columbian collections? I mean, what might that look like?
Absolutely. And I think that at some level, at some point, we're going to have to reinvent these property relations in the more open source sense. I see, for one, the idea of collaborative ventures or joint ventures in which objects come to a group that can circulate those objects much more robustly than the sort of single owner system that we have now. For example, if the Texas museums got together and said, you know, we're going to have these 15 absolute masterpieces of pre-Columbian art, we're going to acquire them and circulate them constantly among these museums and loan them out. I mean, just you're talking about exponential growth in my two criteria, right? Or at least one of them, the experience, the transformative experience of the aesthetic object, and hopefully by having many more people working on the object, you might get also a richer historical record out of those. The open source also, I think that Robin is so important when it's not jettisoning property, it's modifying it in a way that works with our criteria. And I would be open in pre-Columbian to, I just think it's ridiculous that we don't have international consortia or international sorts of abilities to modify, because there's something that we haven't talked too much about, but national patrimony in the object field is a thing that creates these enormous barriers. You know, they're talking about building fences and walls between Arizona and Mexico, et cetera. Well, believe me, we have those as far as important cultural objects go, especially, you know, quite frankly, from Mexico. And that's something I could talk about at length, but I won't at this point. But that probably single-handedly frustrates the circulation of these objects in very important ways. And there's something that Mexican intelligentsia are also extremely interested in breaking apart. I think, and perhaps because they see open source software all over Mexico, they see all of these different models of circulation.
I'm curious about, you know, when I think about this particular situation or my own field, African art history, I really see the effect of digitization projects like one I know that you've been involved in, Rex, where you're making these collections available online. And, you know, one outcome of that has been, you know, pushed towards, I mean, in fact, many of the reasons that these databases are created are things like Nazi-looted art, you know, databases where you are now showing what you have, you know, in your collection in the museum world, in order to allow for claims of the heirs of people who were whose art was stolen during the Nazi period. But digitization projects, I think, also are transforming stakeholders because, let's say you have a lot of, you know, pre-Columbian objects from Mexico distributed all over the world. Now there are people all over the world thinking about these objects, thinking about them as a kind of shared human heritage, and feeling a kind of, you know, ownership or a stake in the objects that I think the result of this is really going to be a kind of transformation into a kind of transnational stakeholder. And I'm curious about how your fields have been affected by the availability of information, research, databases, you know, and this type of thing. How has that kind of transformed who the stakeholders are in your field and the the definition of ownership.
I could start. I think in science, you actually saw with the advent of the internet, I think everything went out there. We were sharing with everyone all of the information that the scientists also started realizing they wanted to do the same thing. They were noticing their concepts of journals, which everyone would have to huge subscription fee, or your university or wherever you're affiliated with, these huge subscription fees in order to get access and read. And sometimes I had to pay in order to get access to something that I gave them. So I give them and they put it up there, and then now I pay them in order to read what I gave them. And there's a huge push in the sciences to actually go towards where we're being more open. And it's directed actually a lot of the top people, the top scientists in Washington saying, look, not only is it that we're restricting scientists, and especially when you're at a smaller university, you don't have the budget for thousands of journals, but we're also restricting other people who are interested in science but aren't scientists and affiliated with the university. So if you're talking about your typical science teacher, she's not going to have these subscriptions, or he or she, to dozens of journals, but now they don't have access. So we're moving towards having several of the journals, and as they kind of pop up, I've been noticing a lot of the major journals are also coming up with their own one that's open. It's open access. It's bringing in a lot more of the ideas together as a big clearinghouse for research to just kind of throw it out there. And another area would also, where I'm more interested, is the genome, human genome sequencing, where there's a big conversation about keeping it a lot more open. If you throw everyone's information all out there, then there's not going to be a bias about information. If you hold it back and are real constricted and don't show it, then that's where everyone becomes more fearful of sharing it. And so I think that's where it kind of leans towards the discussion here. If you put everything out there and everyone enjoys it and looks all around and appreciates it, then it's all appreciated, versus when you close it and hide everything, that's when people start to worry more.
I've seen a very similar, thank you. I've seen so many advantages to kind of opening up the discussion, if I can sort of speak broadly about that, in development. When we've, in product development, I guess what I'm talking about. And ever since there's been just a revolution in especially electronic product development and software, there's also been an amazing proliferation of experts who are available to basically facilitate things, again, things getting done or things getting accomplished. I've had the joy of working with various people, unnamed, people in the Houston area or elsewhere, who have brought to me their expertise, their ability to put products together that I know I wanted, and I spoke to them about whether they were possible. I could have never designed them from scratch by myself. It was only in going to these consultants or these experts where basically the whole application has become possible. And from their perspective, they made money or they had success because someone like me came to them and asked. They knew how to do it, but they didn't have anyone to do it for, to oversimplify to a great extreme. And I think that in many cases, ownership and sharing of cultural heritage and cultural property is the same way. If a country or a person owns something, and that's it, there's no moving forward, there's no growth. Whereas if there's a way to facilitate putting that person who owns the object or that country that owns the object in contact with people who want to see and want to experience and want to grow or want to learn or want to develop or study that object, then all of a sudden everything starts flowing back and forth. The minute that you put roadblocks down, and I see this at my company all the time, the minute someone puts an ultimatum down and says, this isn't working until my consultant fixes this problem, and all of a sudden it's not in everyone's best interest to move forward, things stop. And I think that you always have to keep your eye on the ball of what the goal is, which is to move forward and to get people involved who can move forward and who can move the cultural world forward in this case.
And I think if you look at actually the revolution in media that we've seen in the past 20 years, we're all familiar with the concepts of Napster, uploading music, and how the models have changed over the past decade, 15 years, that we wouldn't have imagined have changed. the ability to enjoy something without, or to observe something without really distracting from the object itself, and to have those access points at places in which a multitude of people can see them that could never have actually seen the physical object, or never could have actually perhaps purchased the album that the song came on. That starts to press and change the way that we observe and we expect property values to be respected. And so the key, I think, is to, and I think that what motivates people is the access to be able to see something that they're interested in a way that's not diminishing to someone else. And when I think of how that relates back to the arts, the ability to have a mechanism by which people can have an experience with an object in a way that's not diminishing or compromising the way in which somebody else can have that experience with an object is a place that it really makes you say, isn't this a good time to be alive?
Before we open the floor for questions, it seems to me that what we're all moving towards are issues of accessibility and circulation. And, we're all, I think, struggling in our respective fields with how to help, how to participate in creating a mechanism where ideas can move more freely while still protecting, affording a kind of, protection to the creator or the owner of the object. And certainly we're not advocating just, throwing, everything out into the open. James, I wonder if you can think about your experience in New Guinea, a place where ownership and property operate in very different ways. Are there lessons from New Guinea? Are there mechanisms in New Guinea that we could think about applying to the West?
Well, thank you. I don't think I'm actually going to say anything very different from the kind of themes that have been emerging here. One of the things that New Guinean people understand very clearly is that objects are not valuable in their own right. They're valuable in exchange. So as they circulate, they create relationships. People are aware of where things have come from. They understand that they're obligated to the people who've given them to them, and thereby value is generated for people all around. So I would want to abstract some of what we've heard today into a kind of plea to think about relationships as the way that value is generated. I think I'd want to say something as well about the dangers of allowing exchange value to kind of obliterate the idea of use value. So if you just think that something's valuable because of the amount you can sell it to someone else for, then you are actually thinking about how you can, the exchange value is the thing that takes precedence. And selling to someone else when you own something as property is in fact to cut a relationship. If I sell you something, it's yours, you take it away and you go and do what you want with it. I think that what we need to be looking for in all these spheres really are ways that we can have exchange, allow other people to use things in ways that generate relationships which are ongoing, that give value to both sides. And there are several examples. I did some work with the British Museum a couple of years ago where they had a fabulous project which was to try and think about objects in their collection in a Melanesian way. That is, how are we going to utilize these objects to generate and maintain relationships with people in the Pacific rather than just hold on to them because these are things that we own. And it was really very exciting. They brought people from all over the Pacific to the collections in London and allowed them to go and see things in the stores. I spent 2 weeks in the stores with two of my kin from a village in New Guinea. Some of these things hadn't been opened, hadn't been looked at since they were collected in the 1860s. They didn't have any information in the museum about what they were, about how they might have been used, about what they were made for. These people who were illiterate from a village, in the middle of nowhere in New Guinea, picked them up and felt them and talked about them and explained exactly what they were made from, exactly what they were probably being used for. They populated the museum's catalogue with information that would not have been possible. And in return, they were given recognition as people who have knowledge about these things. They were brought to see a place that they would otherwise not have got to. And there is an ongoing relationship there now between those people that the objects facilitated. So the value of the object is not in the object itself, it's in the relationship that it's allowed to be created. People have different interests in objects, and as long as people are aware of and respect other people's interests in objects, then relationships can be ongoing and generating a value.
Thank you. I want to open the floor to questions. Yes?
I want to ask about everybody, it seems it's very encouraging to hear you all, because people seem to be have a consensus and have a sort of a theme about the need to move in a direction. But I would like for you to address the idea of pushback and to talk about the people who are not on the panel, those who would who champion private ownership, going after people who selling objects, selling ideas, selling genomes, and then going after people who they think are using their genomes or their objects without paying them enough. And I want to target that as a specific example, which is not talked about, which I think relates in a way to everything you're talking about, which is the patenting of the genomic material of food crops. And the traditional methods of farming all over the world, including, especially in this country, where farmers can save their seed, which has been a traditional agricultural practice for centuries, if not millennia, which is being challenged by corporations who are patenting their own seed, selling it to farmers, and then preventing their farmers from keeping it so that they have to go back every year and buy the seed from the corporation. I think this is an elephant in the room. It's a major cloud on the horizon, not only for intellectual property, not only for patent issues, but also for food issues.
Well, actually, I know that issue extensively in the sense, I'm actually from Kansas. My grandparents were farmers. My uncles are still farmers. I had a conversation with one of them this summer about the exact issue, about the company who's doing what you're mentioning. They have soybean, and they said it's really special. We're able to use it cultivated by making it resistant, so that you can use pesticides on it and it'll be resistant to it and it'll still grow where normally it doesn't. But they, in return, how they put their patent and how they're enforcing it is that, unlike the common practice, if you actually reuse a seed, they will basically take away your farm. And this is a small farmer, and that means a lot to him. He can't handle a court case, and that's why it's incredibly effective. It's one of those systems where you're trying on one hand to do something where it's a common good, where you're trying to find these, to be able to build up the crop, and that I applaud them for. They're doing a lot of other research. I know that they're playing around, for instance, with getting crops that will be, heat resistant and perhaps be able to use some of the areas in Africa that they normally don't get a good yield out of, and be able to put things into them like keratin and be able to put that into rice so you can actually give more nutrients to people. So there's a positive benefit, and that's where I think their mindset is coming from, is they're thinking, I'm spending all this money playing around with all these, I want to get a gain back, and in the end, we have to decide where we feel like the line should actually be, which I think goes back to the agreement that we have with the lawyers and whether or not we want to move those lines. In biomedical research, I can say that, for instance, in genes, we're going through court cases right now trying to make the decision exactly where we think that line is. The example is they're looking at the breast cancer gene. It was patented and by a particular company. They're doing the testing on individuals. They hold a monopoly on the test, and therefore they can charge you a lot of money to look to see if you have this breast cancer gene. A consortium of people came together and decided to sue them, and they said that the patent was invalid. The first court agreed with the people suing, the second court agreed with the company, and now we're probably going to go up to the Supreme Court, which will make the decision as a common good, as collective society, exactly where we feel like these laws should actually be, and where can we make sure the rights of the individual and the rights of the company are best served in making decisions for patents. And I think that that ends up being where the decision for most of the science actually comes from, that I've looked in research, is coming from court cases, making the decision between the two and trying to weigh the balance.
Thank you very much. I have I wanted to speak to the first question about property rights, and I'm very glad she was able to answer the second part of the question, because that's not at all my expertise. I will answer to the general question of what would be the response, I guess, of the people who are property owners, and would there be pushback? I think what we're trying to identify here might be described as a third way. I think part of the problem that comes in is that there tends to be this sort of idea that either everything is wide open and available to everyone, or it's very tightly controlled and owned by a few stingy people that aren't going to show it to anybody. I think what we're trying to identify is something that benefits everyone, including the property owners. And what I think is necessary is to convince the property owners that we're not talking about anarchy, that we're not talking about stealing all of their things and being rid of them. What we're talking about is making the objects that they own, or the technology that they own, or whatever it is, more productive. If they own a piece of art, good for them, and thank them for supporting the art world by caring enough to invest in art. On the other hand, there may be a more valuable use for that art than sitting in their living room, if it's an important piece of art. There may be people who want to study it. There may be people who want to view it and experience it. It may want to tour around the world, and by bringing that idea and that concept to the attention of that art owner, to oversimplify, and I appreciate you putting up with this little comic, to bring it to that attention of that person, that there's this great opportunity for their art to be experienced and shared by everyone while remaining theirs, I think is an opportunity that we can all benefit from. And I think that's where there would be not so much pushback from either side.
Is there another question? Yeah.
One question I have for the gentleman with the expertise on the beginning, is that correct?
Could you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, I'm interested in your concept of spirituality and the common good. I would look at the common experience of their objects. The surrealists here, the Menil collection, looked at the beginning almost as a continent and its influence on surrealism. It's not that they understood their spirituality, they were able to connect with it and they wanted to express it. So I really, it's also, you see that in pre-Columbian art as well, there's a link from the beginning to pre-Columbian, is that objects had to have a function, had to have an energy. It's polite to experience somebody else's energy or work. And going from that basic concept of shared spirituality and versus the surrealism aspect of what, I guess, the modern day, we look at it differently. How do people perceive these objects without the knowledge from the Indians themselves, from the graders themselves? There's such a large distance now. You're trying to link the two. What do you learn?
So Rex needs to answer about pre-Columbian. I actually live with people who continue to make objects and treat them as if they were persons. But if I try to explain this to you, it's going to take a little while. So it's very much to do with not making a subject-object distinction. I'm not going to do the long version, but we tend to think that there's something out there which is inanimate, and then there are human beings. So we think of nature as being inanimate, if you like, and we think of human beings as animate and agentive. The people that I live with see all sorts of forces and all sorts of effects happening in the world, and they live with those things as if they were other kinds of being, other kinds of person, if you like, so that they relate to the land in a way as if it is populated. Now, it's actually not so crazy to do so. When they look at a piece of land, they are seeing in the landforms, in the old growth gardens, in all sorts of things, they're seeing people who were there before. They're seeing where they were generated. They're seeing the substance of the substance that they were formed from. They're seeing their actions. They're seeing the effects of their actions on things. So people are actually there in the landscape, if you like, even once they've died or once they've gone. People have relationships to land in that way. I'm not doing a good job, but it would take longer than I've gone. Sorry, but Rex, you wanted to...
Well, no, just very, very quickly, I'll tell you a brief story that I think speaks to your point. I did my field work in a Maya village called Choquiacantel in Guatemala that backed up onto this beautiful mountain. At about the midpoint of the mountain, there was the mesa where that's where everyone worships, right? And there were 6 or 7 large monuments that made a half circle that defined the place where they could burn and do their religion. 3 of them were pre-Columbian stelae that formed this half circle, right? And while I was living there, the 3 pre-Columbian stelae disappeared. Before they disappeared, I got to see them interact with the stelae a lot, and they addressed them as Kanan Katat, which in Maya is mother, father. You know, here's our mother, here's our father. So there was this direct sort of, they disappeared, and it wasn't that they were horrified, they were absolutely nonplussed when I showed them several months later that the stelae were on sale in Brussels at an art auction. And they did not know what to do with that. It wasn't, again, they didn't say, oh, those Belgian people are the worst people ever or anything. They just, what does that even mean? How can you sell our ancestors is basically what they were trying to figure out. And I think to this day, this was so important to them that during the Dirty War in the 1980s, when they were systematically killing Maya people, the military wanted to put a helicopter pad on the mesa, and everybody, the evangelicos, what do we call those? The evangelicals, can we say? The evangelicals, the Catholics, and the people who practice Maya religion all went up and stood there and said, you're going to have to kill us all if you're going to mess with these stelae or take them away. And I was living there about 3 or 4 years after that event happened, and the fact that then they were left to go to the art market as beings that were sold in Europe, completely just, they didn't know what to do with that.
So maybe one more question? One more? Yes.
Concerning the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, my understanding is that originally Mr. Menil signed a contract with the Orthodox Church of Cyprus that after the fresco has stayed years before, in 17, 18 years, it would have been returned to Cyprus. So it's not that the Greek Orthodox Church of Cyprus demanded the art that it is here. The whole thing was set up a priori in terms of the contract. My question is the following. Cyprus had a tremendous opportunity in having a piece of art here, seen by lots of visitors, a situation that wouldn't have been possible in Cyprus, because that item was under the Turkish on Cyprus. So, of course, let me wind back, but my question is, what are we going to do? Obviously, they cannot put it up to that church in Turkish by Cyprus because of obvious reasons. So, unless they want to emulate the grand idea of Mr. Menil to build something and show it, I think it's to their disadvantage to demand this piece right now, given the great position this piece has in our society. Any comment?
Well, I can tell you that, we feel enormously privileged to have had the frescoes here in this temporary way. And, for us, it really embodies the kind of philosophy of that the Menils had about objects, and that, that sometimes you will just intersect with them in a kind of, temporary way. But we understand very clearly why the Cypriots want their beautiful frescoes returned home. And, what I think is really remarkable about this story is that it's not up to us to to make any, demands about how these will be shown or how they will be cared for. We, of course, feel, happy for the Cypriots that they will be reconnected with these works of art, and confident that the Archbishop will find a setting that's, showing them to their best advantage. Clearly, the people of Cyprus would very much like for these frescoes to go back to Lisi, and that was certainly Mrs. de Menil's hope and the former Archbishop's hope that that one day they would be recited at Lisi, and the whole design of the chapel really speaks to that. The kind of glass interior is the outline of the chapel at Lisi, and it is a very ephemeral design. The chapel itself is built to be reopened, so there was a real acknowledgement that these were here temporarily. Of course, we would welcome, the opportunity to have spent more time with them, but it's, I think, really a credit not only to Mrs. de Menil's thinking, but to the Archbishop's thinking that this relationship ever developed.
But the point is, it is a relationship, and it's not up to Kristina or the collection here to determine what kind of form that relationship will take once they've received back their objects or their things. One would hope that the relationship is ongoing. I mean, I'm completely outside in this. I have no right to speak about this at all. But it really, this is New Guinean thinking. They will return something, and then you sit and wait and see what happens. Are these people going to consider this an ongoing relationship? Will there be more value created by the connection? And that's not something that you can do anything about, really, is it?
Okay. So, yes?
I'm hoping that you might clear up some misconceptions that I think I have. Part of the kind of mythology or the history around the chapel is that it indeed was consecrated so that it could be used for religious services, so that its function was not just as an artwork, but as a space in which worship would happen. And we all know some people meditating there, but that's not quite the same thing as a place in which worship occurs. So I have one question. I'm assuming then that at some point a deconsecration service will occur. Okay.
That is our, yes.
This is where I'd like some clarification. What I read in the New York Times indicates that the pieces, the frescoes, will be going into a museum, that their religious setting here, their religious context here, will no longer function when they return to Cyprus, that they won't be in a worship space, but will be in a museum space. Correct me if I'm wrong.
We actually are in no position to tell you about what the plans are for the frescoes when they return. And what was reported in the New York Times is certainly, I think, more detailed than any information we've received about what their intended use is. But you raise a really important point, and it's one that I was discussing with Bertrand Davizak, our former chief curator, who was visiting recently, and we were taking advantage of the opportunity to interview him on film about the fresco story. And I asked him why Mrs. de Menil and the Archbishop decided to create a consecrated space, a separate space from the museum, because as I've been talking about earlier, one of the things that I really love about the attitude towards objects here is that objects have lives, and whatever function they were originally serving is one function in their history, and when they come here into the museum, there's really a belief that what they're doing here, the way that historical objects are performing or African objects are performing, is equally as important to a function they once served. And so if you apply that kind of thinking, then I ask, why did Mrs. de Menil feel that this was a separate case? And he told me, Kristina, you're thinking about Mrs. de Menil as a collector and as an art patron, and you need to think of her as a believer. And that was really an act of faith, and I think an incredibly moving one if we consider, the time at which she was faced with these 38 fragments that had clearly been looted. This museum was under construction. It was very late in her life. She did not need another project, And she I think, really related to the expression of faith that is a votive chapel. And, you know, I think that's really what moved her to make this great effort. So that seems like a good note to end on. I really thank you all for coming, but thank you to the panelists. This was fantastic. I learned a lot, and it gave me a lot of new ideas. Thank you.